Good evening. It's a pleasure to be here in honor of the History Makers. My name is Daymond John. I'm known these days for my role on ABC's Shark Tank, but it was in 2003 that the History Makers traveled to New York City to the FUBU offices to interview me for the archives. I was the youngest interviewee at the time, just 36 years old. Initially operating out of the trunk of my car and my mother's house in Queens with a sewing machine and my partners Keith, Carl, and Jay, we started a new industry of hip-hop apparel that would attract international clientele. Now, I cannot say that I understood then the importance of my History Makers interview, but I have to say, I do now. My interview, like others, are now housed permanently at the Library of Congress. 2020 has brought a lot of attention to the obstacles that Black entrepreneurs face. And that is why being here tonight means so much to me. In 2006, the History Makers honored three great Black men, General Colin Powell in Washington, D.C., Ambassador Andrew Young in Atlanta, and the founder and CEO of Black Enterprise magazine, Earl Graves Sr. in Chicago, Illinois. This would be the first time they would honor a business leader for the History Makers, an Evening with PBSTV series. Let's take a look at that year in review.
We'll be shooting a nice wide shot.
Do we need to record that music?
We're going the other direction.
Dear and trusted friend, Earl Graves has an incredible set.
I've looked all over.
Carol, is Juliana up?
I just see a little bit of this and I see...
You have my speech.
John Lewis, William Hutchins, Henry Parks, Edward Brooke, and I to serve on his advisory board.
It's very important for people to have a sense of place, a sense of belonging, a sense of history, of where they came from. People go from Harriet Tubman to Martin Luther King, and the same names being mentioned over and over again. And yet I would talk to people and I would hear these wonderful stories about their families or people that influenced them, names that were not in the public venue as much. We actually interview people for 2.5 hours, and we ask them to bring photographs of themselves, and we have them narrate them. With the advent of new technologies, these archives will be searchable by image and text.
And there was what is known as the Old Bunch Plantation outside of Raleigh, North Carolina.
We have a very strong educational initiative to really bring this history to life and for people to see these stories, and these people. But our goal is really to record this information, and we say that this is America's missing stories, that American history really won't be complete without this information.
father's admonition was,
What message
what was your purpose? You're no better than anybody else. Nobody's better than you. Your first trip to strength all the time. You're thinking all the time. Those qualities that gives you a proclamation.
Tonight, though, we're here to celebrate one of the Goodman Theatre's own, theatrical director Chuck Smith. Many of you have seen and admired his work over the years, even if you had never seen the man himself, as I had not. Most of us do not know his history, which is why we are here tonight.
Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming General Colin Powell. Please have a seat. Good evening. General Powell, thank you so much for being here this evening. You honor us with your presence.
Thank you very much, Juan, and I'd like to express my thanks to the History Makers and to Juliana for bringing us all together this evening on this important occasion.
Stand by. Can we just start? Can you just greet her again?
I was born at the beginning of an era of enormous change. Change so great, it will be called the Second American Revolution.
The modern world was in crisis, and with that crisis came an opportunity for my generation to change America in a way that was good news for all Americans.
We were trying to change America morally. We would redeem the soul of America.
I am Andrew Young.
I am Andrew Young.
I am Andrew Young.
Please join me in welcoming Andrew Young.
Wait, there we go. Okay, let's do it again.
Well, he was in New York as well. I trained under Grady White.
How are you doing?
Good, how are you?
Good evening. Tonight we honor a man I greatly admire, Earl G. Graves, Sr. This publishing giant and luminary of American business is a man whom my late father, John H. Johnson, respected. And even more importantly, my dad considered Earl Graves a dear and trusted friend. Did you know that Earl Graves and my father went out on sales calls together? That's right. When advertisers and agencies acted a bit slow to understand how important Black enterprise and ebony were for them to reach African American consumers, those two dynamos teamed up and called on them together. Can you imagine Earl Graves and John Johnson lighting up a room with their extreme persuasion?
I am eternally thankful to Earl Graves. Grateful because he is responsible for much of our success tonight. Just a note about how I met Earl Graves. I met him in August of 2000. Just to give perspective, we just did our first interview in February of 2000. Most people thought harebrained idea, harebrained scheme. They didn't really understand. Archives sound old and dusty and not of much use. But I met him on this cruise, and let's say he could run, but he could not hide, and I was chasing him like I was chasing a lot of people on the cruise that time. Captive audience, you know. He listened to me talk about the History Makers and he immediately sat for an interview and then encouraged others to sit. He got Ossie Davis and Ruby Dee to come. He got Susan Taylor to come and she wrote letters on our behalf. So really tonight is a special one. Now the History Makers archive houses individual stories that are forming an intricate tapestry of the fundamental truth of history. In this history, truth, guilt, shame take a backseat to witness. Our grandmothers become more important than our textbooks. The next-door neighbor holds more authority than the New York Times. And stories like the ones you are going to hear tonight, become the sole arbiters and creators of our past. It is really important that these stories are not forgotten, that they are documented and shared. Now, we must get on with our show. This eldest child of Julia and Horace Mann, this leader of SNCC, this movement activist turned politician, this elder statesman, this chairman of the board of the NAACP, this nationally syndicated journalist, teacher, and civil rights leader. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure and my honor to introduce tonight's host, the one and only Mr. Julian Bond.
Thank you. Thank you. Earl Graves and I met in the crucible of tremendous change. So it was in 1969, 1 year after Robert Kennedy's death, that he'd asked Charles Evers, Shirley Chisholm, John Lewis, Andrew Brimmer, William Hudgens, Henry Parks Jr., Edward Brooke, and I to join the advisory board of this new magazine and help open the doors to corporate America. It is my great pleasure and my great honor to introduce to you Mr. Earl G. Graves, Sr.
Oh, my Jesus, oh, my Jesus, till he comes. Oh, my Jesus, 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 oh, my Jesus.
Just gotta get the sideburns going and you're all set, baby.
Clapped in church on Sunday morning, and Grandma's Hayes played the tambourine so well. Grandma's Hayes used to usher out on one, and she said, Billy, don't you run so fast. You might fall on a piece of glass, and there might be snakes in that grass lawn. Grandma's Hayes, you know that Grandma's Hayes soothed the local unwed mother. Grandma's Hayes used to ache sometimes and swell. Grandma's Hayes used to lift the face and tell her, she said, baby, Grandma, understand that you really love that man, but 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 that man, and that man. Put yourself in Jesus' hands. Put yourself in Jesus' hands. Put yourself in Grandma's hands. And put yourself in Grandma's hands. Like the way you work it. You know that Grandma's hands used to hand me a piece of candy, and Grandma's hands picked me up each time I felt old. Grandma's hands, boy, they really came in handy. She said, Matty, don't you whip that boy. Say, what you want to spank him for? He didn't drop no apple core, but I don't have Grandma anymore. And if I get to heaven, I'll look for. If I get to heaven, I'll look. Matty, don't you whip that boy. If I get to heaven, I'll look for. What you want to spank him for? If I get to heaven, I'll look for. He didn't drop no apple core, but I don't have Grandma anymore. If I get to heaven, I'll look for. Matty, won't you whip that boy? What you? If I get to heaven, I'll look for. Matty, don't you whip that boy? If I get to heaven, I'll look for it. I'll look for. If I get to heaven, if I get to heaven, if I get to Matty, don't you whip that boy? Sit there. What you want to spank him for? Sit. He didn't drop no he didn't drop no he didn't drop the he didn't drop no he didn't drop the 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 If I get to heaven, I'll look for Grandma.